So what I want to do today is start by recapping some of the examples that we discussed last time, and then try to just get clearer about what's going on. So let me briefly remind you of the two examples. So example one was the case of Bruno the time traveler, who goes back in time in the hopes of killing his grandfather and travels back to a time before grandfather had children. And he tries to kill grandfather and fails. Example two is the case of your suicidal friend. So you're having breakfast with her one morning, and she reveals that the previous night she tried to commit suicide. So focusing for now on the case of the suicidal friend, I want us to assess two conditionals. Okay, so I'll just read them out because I have bad handwriting. If friend attempted suicide, she failed. The second one says, had friend attempted suicide, she would have failed. So the first one is what is sometimes referred to as an indicative conditional. And the second one that has this subjunctive mode is sometimes referred to as a counterfactual conditional. So let me set up some scenarios so that we can try to assess these conditionals. So for assessing the first one, suppose that you're with your friend at breakfast and she's telling you that last night she was thinking about suicide. And then her phone rings, she takes the call, and then someone asks you, what happened in the end? Did friend attempt suicide? And you say, well, I don't know whether she made an attempt in the end. But I do know this. If she attempted, she failed. How do I know it? Well, I know it because friend is right there. Had she attempted it and succeeded, she wouldn't be there. She would be dead. So in the proposed scenario, the top conditional is definitely true. There's no question. Now, what about the second one? So suppose that the phone conversation ends and friend reveals that, in fact, she did not attempt suicide. She was just thinking about it. Then one can ask, well, what would have happened had she attempted suicide? Would she have failed? Well, we have no reason to think so. I mean, for all we know, she had a gun and the gun was loaded, and had she attempted it, she would have killed herself. So we get this weird asymmetry between the first case and the second case. Contrast that with a different kind of example. So suppose I just tell you, look, if you start work on Saturday, you'll finish your paper by Sunday. Say that that's true. Then Tuesday comes and you never did the work. It's still true if I say, had you started work on Saturday, you would have been done by Sunday. So a feature of the friend case is that because you have access about information about the future, this asymmetry is generated. So I think what happens is that when you assess the one in the top, you leave fixed what you know about the future. So in this case, you know that she in fact survived. And leaving that fixed when you assess the conditional leads to the conclusion that whatever happened during the attempt, she must have failed because we need to get the result at the end that she survives. With the second one, in contrast, you don't leave fixed what you know about the future. What you say is, you say, okay, let's just consider this alternate scenario, a scenario in which she makes a different decision, proceeds otherwise, and then we see what happened. So maybe one way of thinking of it is that you know what happened. She did not attempt suicide and didn't die. But for assessing the second counterfactual conditional, what happens is that you just consider this different scenario where a miracle occurs. As a result of that, things start working differently, but we continue to apply the laws of physics after the miracle and then just see what happened. And maybe in such a scenario, maybe given this alternate future, she does kill herself. So in other words, whereas for the top one, we keep fixed what we know about the future, in the second case, we don't keep fixed what we know about the future. And that leads to an asymmetry when we have information about the future. Now, what about a similar pair in the case of Bruno? So I'm going to write them down, and I want you guys to think about them. I think the issue is less clear. I think the intuitions are less clear, but I still want you guys to think about them. So the first one says, if Bruno fired, he missed, indicative conditional. The second one says, had Bruno fired, he would have missed, counterfactual conditional. And now consider the following setup. So for assessing the first one, suppose that we know the following. We know that Bruno has traveled to the past and traveled to a time before grandfather had children. And we know that everything's ready, he's aiming, grandfather is standing still, Bruno is an excellent shot, and then we ask, well, what happened? Did he fire? The right answer is, well, I don't know, but I do know this. I do know that if he fired, he missed. Or at least it wasn't a fatal shot, let us say. And again, the reason that's so is because we're leaving fixed information we know about the future of the story. We know that grandfather will live to have children, and we're keeping that fixed when we assess this. Okay, but now the second one, and this is what is likely to come across as more dubious to you guys. Suppose I continue with the story and tell you, in fact, Bruno didn't shoot, he lost his nerve. And then I ask, well, what would have happened had he fired? Is it true that had he fired, he would have missed? I claim that it's not clear. Just like you shouldn't conclude in the top case that had friend attempted suicide, she would have failed. You can't assume in this case that had Bruno not lost his nerve and fired, he would have hit. So what do people think? Do people think that the cases are exactly analogous? Yes. Oh, but wait, we need the microphone. Today, Rose will be in charge.
Was it? Well, so the difference that I see between the two situations is that with Bruno, in order for Bruno to be even in a position to fire, he would have to be alive. So just the fact that he's there to fire seems like it would mean that he would have to miss, whereas in the case with the friend, there's not. Like, the friend doesn't have to survive.
I like the point. I like the point. So let me attempt this development of what you're saying. So an interesting feature of the Bruno case is that just by looking at what's going on at the time of the assassination attempt, we can conclude that he's going to fail because we know this. We know that he is grandfather's grandchild. We know that at that time, grandfather has not had any children. And just putting those two facts together, it seems like we already know that he's going to fail. Now, it's not, of course, that we don't have information about the future. We do have information about the future because the fact that grandfather is Bruno's grandfather entails that grandfather will have children. It's just that information about the future is encoded in information about the present. And I think that that observation is non-trivial. I mean, that observation means that a world in which Bruno fired and missed would be a very strange world. So let's try to see what such a world would be like. So it is a world in which, remember, we're going to try to be consistent. So like we can only say once what happens at each time. So one way to think of it is there's this guy who grows up and he comes to hate a certain individual. Then at some point he travels back in time. Now all these lines mean is something like that if this guy was blinking at this particular time, the blink will continue at that particular time. And if this guy was hungry at this particular time, the guy that appears here will be hungry. Maybe that guy was mentally counting 1, 2, 3, 4, and he disappears. And a guy appears at that point, counting 5, 6, 7, 8, and so forth. And then that guy shoots and kills the target. Well, so far we have a possible world. Of course, it's not a possible world in which it turns out that the guy who was shot turns out to be the grandfather. So it's not that the relevant possibilities don't exist. It's just that the relevant possibilities aren't compatible with what we already know about the future. But notice that something similar happens here too, because the possibility in which our friend does attempt suicide is a possibility which also has a different future. It's just that in this case, the different future entails something special about the present. So as you pointed out, it entails that the guy shot isn't really grandfather. So there's something a little bit weird about it. But there are also things that both cases have in common. So in both cases, there is a possibility. It's a possibility where the future is different. And it's just that in this case, it's also a possibility in which the present turns out not to be as described in the original case. Good. Anybody else? Yes.
So we know that he didn't, like, if he didn't fire, right, then he obviously didn't kill him. So maybe like the consistency of like the universe is encoded in the fact that like he like didn't have the nerve to fire. So he would never have fired. So it doesn't matter that had he fired, he would have missed or not, right? Because like that's where the consistency happens.
I like what you're saying. Okay. This is going to force me to do something I should have done yesterday. So I'm glad I'm going to be able to do it today. So when in both these cases we talk about what would have happened had someone made a different decision, what are we talking about? So let me start with that and then come back to your point. So here is a proposal about what we might mean. And it's going to be a little bit rough, so bear with me. Okay, so the idea is subject S could have acted differently and only if okay, so what I'm in the process of doing is try to give a definition of what it means to say that S could have acted differently. And I'm saying that he could have acted differently provided that there is a logically possible world, so not necessarily a world that obeys the laws of physics at all times, with certain features. And I'm going to list 4. So the first one is that the past, I'm going to call this world W. So up to the time in which the relevant decision took place, the past of our logically possible world W matches the past of our actual world exactly. So we have the actual world, and we have W, and this is the crucial decision point, and up to that point, they are identical. Okay. But at W, a miracle, that is, a violation of the laws of physics, takes place at the relevant time. After that, a miracle takes place, and after that point, the laws continue to apply. So at the crucial time in the actual world, things continue in accordance with the laws. In the new world, a miracle takes place, so there's a divergence. But after that divergence, things continue in accordance with the laws. Okay, but 3. Okay, but crucially, the miracle is localized. It happens exclusively inside the relevant subject's brain. And not just that, it's minor enough that it doesn't really change the subject's psychological profile. So if I'm the subject and I like chocolate, then after the miracle, I'm going to continue to like chocolate. And if I believe that the Eiffel Tower is in Paris, then after the miracle, I'm going to continue to believe that the Eiffel Tower is in Paris. Okay, so the only thing that changes, and this is crucial, what we ask is that the result of the miracle be that the subject makes a different decision without altering her psychological profile, and that as a result of that decision, she acts differently. Okay, so to see what's going on, suppose that I am chained to this chair and that I stay put, so I do not get up. And then you ask, in that sense of could I have gotten up? Well, the answer is no. It's true that there is a logically possible world in which a big miracle occurs, say a miracle in which the chains just disappear and I walk away. But that's not allowed. The only miracles that are allowed are tiny miracles inside my brain. They change whether I decide to get up. And because I'm going to remain chained, that decision isn't going to result in my acting differently. But what about the decision to drop the eraser? So suppose that I, in fact, decided not to drop it. There's a logically possible world in which there's a tiny difference in my brain that causes me to make a different decision and drop the eraser. You have a question?
About the chains we were just talking about. So you said we allowed just a tiny change in our brains, right? What about the tiny change occurred before you had the chains on?
Oh, good. That is a good point. So in order for this to work, it's essential that the change take place at the right time. So it's essential that the change take place at the moment where you made the decision that you in fact made, or maybe like a tiny bit earlier. No, that's absolutely right. Okay, so now getting back to your question. So notice the following. This definition of could have acted otherwise is unfazed by determinism. This definition does not care whether we live in a deterministic world. Because look, suppose that this world is deterministic. I, in fact, did not drop the eraser, so someone with access to the initial conditions and the laws could have been able to calculate that I would have not dropped the eraser. But according to this definition, it's still true that in the relevant sense of could, I could have acted differently. Because it's still true that there's a logical possibility in which a violation of the laws occurs, which has these features, and I do drop the eraser. So this is the answer to your question. In assessing the counterfactual conditionals, I suspect that the notion of could and would that's relevant is one that is roughly along these lines. And if that's true, then it doesn't matter what the laws tell us. Now, this allows me to get back to something important that people were asking me last time after class. And I regret not having said it last time. So here is an undeniable feature of this characterization of could have acted differently. It is unbearably sloppy. So it would never happen in a physics class that anyone would dare give a definition of this kind. Like, what do you mean, just localized in the brain? I mean, that's compatible with many, many things. What do you mean leaving someone's psychological profile intact? Like, we haven't said anything really about what counts as the profile. I just gave you guys some examples. So it would be a mistake to suggest that you can develop like a real theory on the basis of that. But this is what I think it can be used for. I think that the notion of what we could and couldn't have done, and similarly our assessment of these counterfactual conditionals, was born in the marketplace. So this is not the result of scientific theorizing. These are notions that emerged in everyday practice. And insofar as our everyday practice is sloppy, one should expect our best efforts to spell out the concepts that emerge from that practice to be sloppy. So, in other words, if you're doing physics and you're trying to discover the ultimate physical nature of the world, then even if our methods are sloppy, you might expect that the world itself is not. So the world is going to help us end up with precise notions. But maybe in a case like this, there is nothing for the world to do to help. So all we have to go on in building our notions is the sloppy practice that the notions are based on. It certainly does not mean that this is useless. So in fact, I mean, as we discussed last time, and as we'll see, the issue of whether this is a good way of spelling out our sloppy practice is essential to assessing questions of free will. And for some people, there is nothing more important in life than questions of free will. So it's not that it's useless, but one shouldn't expect that it's going to have the kind of rigor that you would get in physics.
Am I allowed to ask?
Yes, of course. You're encouraged.
I don't see why a suspension of the physical laws has to be necessary. If we assume that there are some, I don't know how brain laws work, but it seems like there are some indeterministic processes where if they just gone differently, not because the laws were different, but just because they went differently, then everything would still come out the right way.
You are absolutely right. So if we live in an indeterministic world, then you can have divergences of this kind that occur not because of a violation of the laws, but just because some indeterministic process works differently. If one wanted to take that into account, then one thing one could do is one could clarify that what's meant here by miracle is really just possible miracle. So we're allowed to violate the laws, though we don't have to. And then maybe it'll turn out that the relevant world is in fact lawful all the way. All that matters is that at the crucial time there be a divergence, that the divergence be local, and that it lead to a decision which causes the subject to act differently. Yes?
So you started on these 4 like rules, I guess. Whenever somebody asked a question about Bruno, so I'm wondering, when you say a world W in which the passive W matches the real world exactly, are you saying that in the Bruno case that if he shot, it would become a different world?
Ah, good. That's connected to your question. So yeah, so what is the, in the Bruno case, what world should we look at when we assess this recipe? So let's think. So the actual world is one in which just the story told from past to future is one which is as follows. Grandfather is born in the usual way, and then at some point, when grandfather is a young man, this guy appears out of nothing. Just out of nothing, someone appears, a fully formed adult named Bruno. That fully formed adult tries to kill grandfather and fails, let us say because he lost his nerve. And then at some point, a few days later, that guy disappears. And then years later, Bruno has a daughter who has a son who gets called Bruno. And when he becomes a young man, he suddenly disappears. That's what the actual world looks like. So let's now apply the recipe. So let's suppose that at the crucial point in which Bruno lost his nerve, we allow. Whoa. Yes? Already.
So you said that the dude appears, tries and fails, and then disappears.
Yes.
So that means he would be going back into the future at that point, right?
I mean, that is our gloss on what's going on. So the reason.
I mean, you just didn't mention that when you were at the end of the timeline, so I was just wondering. You sounded like he disappeared nowhere, so.
No. I mean, so if one was just to describe, like time by time, what things happen, we would just talk about like who's where and who appeared out of nowhere. This information about who travels in time is something that we only get by looking at the entire mosaic and trying to identify patterns in it. Okay, so yeah, so there's this guy. So this is Bruno's appearance, and that's Bruno's disappearance. So maybe Bruno's appearance, Bruno's disappearance. This is the crucial point where, in fact, he lost his nerve. So then what we want our alternate world to be like is one which is exactly like this world in the past. So grandfather gets born, Bruno appears out of nothing, and at this crucial point, a different decision is made. He doesn't lose his nerve, a divergence takes place, and from that point on, the laws of physics continue to hold. So what's going to happen? Well, one thing that's certainly not going to happen is that grandfather has children, and one of them becomes Bruno. So we just end up in this very different world. We end up in a world in which just someone appears out of nowhere, kills someone else. and then just other things happen.
I'm just a little confused because maybe I misunderstood what happened on Monday, but I thought you said, like in the Marty McFly example, that we weren't going to deal with different worlds in this class, and that we were talking about just to start staying in the same timeline.
Right. So what I was talking about then was the idea that when we're told what reality is like according to the film, we want a single narrative. So in other words, we want there to be the timeline of what happens in the film, and we want to know what happens at each point. Now, what's interesting is that one can then ask a different question. One can say, okay, I understand the timeline in the film. Now I want to know what would happen if you made a little change someplace and then applies the laws and gets something different. So I think that's easiest to see in the suicidal friend case. So in that case, we just have a story about what reality is like. It's one in which she thinks about suicide, she doesn't do it, goes and has breakfast, and so forth. And then you can say, okay, I agree that that's how the world is. Now tell me what it would have been like had a certain miracle taken place.
So what Marty McFly does is completely different from what we're discussing.
That's right, because Marty McFly's adventures are, according to the story, supposed to be what actually happened. So here's a different kind of film that someone might have made. So they might have first told the story of what actually happened, and then said, okay, but suppose he had done otherwise. And then what they do is they consider a different world in which things happen at some point a little bit differently. And then the narrative carries on. So that's a way of thinking about could, given this picture. So when you ask could questions, what you're asking is not about reality as it actually is. What you're asking about is about reality as it would have been, according to a story where a little miracle takes place at a crucial point. And what happens with movies is that normally we don't expect them to be of that kind. Normally we just want the movie to tell us a single story about a certain reality, according to the film. Okay. Now, I mean, the reason your two questions are connected is because whereas in the suicidal friend case or in the me shackled to the chains case, the future is, the divergent future is different from the actual future, but not that different. In the Bruno case, the divergent future is really different because it turns out that Bruno, rather than being grandfather's grandchild, actually isn't. I mean, we'll have to look at the details, but maybe he's nobody's child. Maybe he just appears out of nowhere and is on cast. So I think that you're right to point out that there is an asymmetry between the two cases. Okay, yes?
Right. So just going back to what she said about how, like, it doesn't seem like you need a miracle if you have, if it's possible to be, if it's possible, like if you don't have determinism, like it does seem to me that that like the whole thing with the miracle is just to sort of escape determinism, because determinism lets you, I mean, term kind of requires that if you know something, if you know the state of the world, then you know the state of the world at every single point. But I was just wondering, like, is this, I guess, is this alternative interpretation plausible where you say that, like, since you don't know, like, the entire state of the world, you only just know, like, these facts, like, those facts could be consistent with a lot of different worlds, right? And, like, one of them is the real world, but then there could be other ones where, like, different things happened. So could you say that rather than, like, a miracle occurred, you could say, consider these other possible worlds that are consistent with what you already know?
I see what you're saying. That's especially interesting because very often the only information we have about the world is macro information. So very often what we know about someone's mind is not like the details of their neural network. It's you know, just information about some beliefs and some desires and maybe some past actions and things like that. So I think that one thing one could do is try to propose a different definition of could. One which, instead of insisting that W matched the actual world in the past, whether or not we know about the relevant past events, maybe what we require is just a W match the actual world insofar as what we know about the actual world. And one could try the other definition out. So one could just see whether the notion of could one gets respects judgments of this kind. My suspicion is that this kind of definition will work better. But I think that the only thing we can do is develop it and test it and look at cases and see what happens. It seems to me that the true test is whether you get the right judgments about free will. So the true test is whether you get a definition of could that delivers this result. So suppose we have this as a sufficient condition for acting freely. So we say, look, I'm not going to give you a full definition of free action, but I am going to tell you this. If S could have acted otherwise, then she acted freely. So a test for a revised definition of could is to see what happens when you spell out this could in the new way. See whether the notion of free will that you get matches our ordinary practice of ascribing free will to people in various circumstances. And to some extent, it's an empirical project. It's like the project of figuring out how people would judge different cases. Now that we've made, yes, you're going to be next. Now that we've made the connection with free will, I want to point you to something that you might think of as a disappointment. So I, at least, when I came into philosophy, I was sure that I was going to learn deep truths about things like free will. But on the picture I'm presenting here, free will turns out to be this incredibly boring thing. So free will, as understood here, is just a way of describing what goes on when it comes to alternate scenarios, which just contain a certain kind of miracle. So when saying that someone acted freely, you're not saying very much about anything deep. I mean, you're just talking about a scenario in which the person made a different decision and acted differently. I think partly for this reason, there are philosophers who reject this way of thinking. They think, look, if you end up with something this boring, then you've changed the subject. I think that they're mistaken. I mean, I think that sometimes when you think clearly about these issues, you end up with disappointing results. And the thing to do is to follow the arguments and embrace the disappointment rather than clinging to one's initial preconceptions about what this is like. But I will not pretend that this is a fully resolved issue.
So it seems to me under this definition of free will, and that you only need at least, you need no more than two possibilities of choices of action. So it would still be reasonable to say that Bruno acted freely despite the fact that he never had the ability to shoot his grandfather. Is that a reasonable statement?
So I think that if the definition delivers that conclusion, we have to throw the definition away. Because I think that our ordinary thinking about free will is connected to people having the ability to act otherwise. So the hope in setting forth this definition is that it captures what it is to have a certain ability. So the idea is that the people who have the ability are exactly the people who, given a certain miracle which causes them to make a different decision, they would have acted differently. That's what it is to have the ability. So the reason when I'm chained to the chair, I don't have the ability is that even if there is a miracle, I won't be able to get up. But I like what you say, because what you say suggests a way of testing this definition. So if one can find a case where intuitively we have the ability, and this says that you couldn't have acted otherwise, or where intuitively we don't have the ability, and this says that you could have acted otherwise, then we should discard the definition. Okay, so one last question, and we have to stop early for bureaucratic reasons. So,
what if like the critical moment where the decision was made was before Bruno went back in time?
Okay, then according to this definition, so by before, of course, you mean in the future.
After the, like, that moment, but before BA. Or before, like, he disappears.
Oh, okay, so what's happened is he's aimed, lost his nerve, not shot, and then thought, oh, well, headed back towards the time machine, and then at that point, a small miracle.
Like, before he goes back in time to first shoot him.
Okay, so we have the Bruno in the future, and before he heads into his time machine, which will cause him to reappear here? Yeah. Okay, so on this definition, we are not allowed to change the past. So if...
But that doesn't have to be Bruno who, like, appeared and disappeared and tried to shoot his grandfather. Like, if a man appeared and disappeared and tried to shoot his grandfather, and Bruno thinks it's him, then goes back and tries, right? But like he could also say it's someone else and then not go back.
Okay, I think I see what you're saying. Let me describe the scenario, see if it corresponds to what you're saying. Okay, so in the past, someone appears out of nowhere, doesn't shoot, and then disappears. As things actually happen, there's someone who decides to go into a time machine and disappears thinking precisely the thought that the guy who appeared is thinking when he appears. But now consider an alternate scenario in which a small miracle happens, leads to a divergence, and in that alternate future, Bruno decides not to go back to the past. Then that is a world in which, as you point out, we have no reason to think that the guy who appears is Bruno. I mean, maybe he looks like Bruno, maybe he has like a mole in the same place, but he's not Bruno because Bruno never travels in time. So we have another example of what we were talking about earlier, where counterfactuals in time travel scenarios deliver worlds which are very, very weird. And I think that's part of the reason the Bruno case is in some ways disanalogous to the suicidal friend case.